Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the SAFNOG and ZANOG virtual conference. We're very excited to be here today. Firstly, we'd like to acknowledge everybody that has taken their time to prepare for this event, our speakers. A special thank you to our sponsor, Teraco, for making this possible. And of course, thank you to all our attendees who have taken the time to join us today for this meeting. While we had decided to defer the SAFNOG 6 meeting as well as the ZANOG annual meeting this year due to the COVID-19 pandemic, global pandemic, we felt it necessary for us to put something together that is relevant to our region. Because while there are a lot of conferences that have been happening virtually, as well as some aspects of them that were relevant to us, we did not see that any of them spoke directly to our region. So we decided to get together and to put this event together so that we can address the issues, the trends, and the challenges that we have faced as a region, and of course from our regional experts and an international expert who will be speaking to our region specifically. So welcome once again. Just to go over some house rules quickly, this meeting is in webinar mode. We would like to encourage all participants to take part. So please use the Q&A section to ask your question. There is a chat section as well for you to use to say hi to everybody. I'm sure we've all missed each other. But other than that, we do encourage that you use the Q&A to ask questions to our speakers as well as our panel. Now, this year has been very challenging in many aspects. There's been some positives as well as some negatives. And one of our biggest negatives was a loss that we suffered recently within the community. I'm talking about the loss of our friend, our dear friend, and a very active member of our community, Malcolm Siegel, whom we lost on the 14th of October. I'd like for us to take this moment now to just recognize him and to just take a moment of silence just to recognize Malcolm. Thank you. So I would like to welcome Mark Tinker from CCOM, but he's also the co-chair for the SAFNOG organization. I'll hand over to him to just say a few words.
Thank you, Portia, and thank you to everybody for making the time to join us this afternoon or morning or evening, wherever else you might be in the world, as we, for the first time, take SAFNOG and together with ZANOG on the web. It has been a challenging time, like Portia had said, due to the pandemic, as you all know, but we have to keep the industry going and the networks going and the operators going. So this is just something we wanted to put together with the ZANOG team, so we can keep the momentum alive. So welcome. We have some pretty interesting talks and panels lined up for you today, and we hope you enjoy. Back to you, Portia. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark. I will now hand over to Don Jolly, who is representing ZANOG. He'll say a few words. Don?
Thanks, Portia. Did I take myself off mute? Just checking in this Zoom world that we have. So yeah, being the sucker that I am, I volunteered for the ZANOG updates. I did ask the ZANOG team if there was anything I should be updating the community on, or spend the next 5 minutes telling some bad jokes to fill in the time. I actually then realized that a lot has happened, well, within the ZANOG Durban cache cluster that we host in Durban. We got a sexy new Juniper MX204 that was donated by ISOC. So we implemented that, and like all good routers, there's nothing really to report. It just works, and it just pushes the packets. And this continues to save gigabits of traffic for the local ISPs in Durban. So I'm going to use a couple of catchphrases and generalizations. So if you are playing any drinking games, so if someone says WFH or new normal, then take a drink. So I think COVID-19's accelerated many trends, and we have slowly been seen over the years. And the ideas of VPNs and work from home is not actually anything new, is it? But now it's the new normal. It's undeniable that the internet traffic has grown over the last 6 to 8 months and far beyond what most of us would forecast. I think with many networks, there was some scrambles to get some new kits in place and upgrade some circuits. But from what I've heard from most of the providers, is that things just carried on. And I believe that this is primarily or part because of the NOG community getting together, and maybe they're you know, the idea that they just want to get a good night's sleep. And yeah, so things just carried on. I mean, some networks offered upgrades of speed at no extra cost because budgets were strained, like all IT budgets are. I think there is an unproven equation that measures the effectiveness of your network proportionally between the length of beards and beers drunk, but we're not going to discuss that now, and which way this equation actually balances out. But I think a tip of the hat to and raise of the glass to the many engineers in the background that have been keeping this oddity called the internet going. So anyway, back to the point is that ZANOG's calendar for the next year, well, we're still not sure. And let me digress again, I guess. And you know, my wife and I, we've been having endless discussions about taking things virtual, and you know, how does that look? And people discussing how to reinvent themselves and take on new challenges. So the idea of should NOGs, and specifically ZANOG, be focusing on in-person events or virtual events now and in the future? I don't know if there's any right or wrong answer for this, but because different people attend the events for different reasons. Some attend to hear the great speakers and content, while others are there for the social networking. And I don't think virtual events have matured to the point where they can take over forging those, you know, creating and forging new connections like physical events do. So like this event, that the great thing about being virtual is that the smaller regions can open up to the world and attract an international audience. Not only that, but vice versa, where international speakers, and we have one today, can speak at these so-called local events. Yeah, so as ZANOG, I think we're going to continue to strive the local, to build the local communities and to have local events. And to bring the local people together to share their stories with their communities. We don't have any dates right now for physical meetings for ZANOG, but I think when we do, we want to do it as soon as possible, and obviously adhere to local legislation and the comfort levels of participants. In the past, ZANOG has been hosting events within South Africa, focusing on Durban, Cape Town, and Joburg, but we would love to hear from the community and possibly grow that in 2021 to other smaller places, while SAFNOG focuses on the greater Southern African region, like Zimbabwe, Botswana, Mozambique, Swaziland, Lesotho, Angola, Namibia. Hope I didn't miss anybody else. Anyway, so I think I've taken more than enough time. Remember to subscribe to the ZANOG mailing list and you know, engage in the community there, and visit nog.net.za. That's it from me.
Thank you, Don. Okay, I don't want to take too much of our time. I will jump right in. Graham, are you ready? Okay, so our first speaker is going to be Graham Banneker. He is from Vumatel, and he's going to be talking to us about how do you prepare for a pandemic. So here you go, and over to you.
Just finding my unmute button. When you start sharing, then everything disappears into different parts of the screen and you can't find anything. Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Yes, as Portia said, I'm from Vumatel. And yeah, let me talk about my experiences of how we've survived the pandemic so far. So how do you prepare for a pandemic? I think the impulsive first response that people would give is, well, you can't, or you don't, or it's not possible. And certainly when some of the issues of the last couple of months started landing on us, there was no context that any of us had from recent history or from anything within the current context of our technologies where we'd ever experienced something like this. The last global pandemic was over 100 years ago, or around 100 years ago, and everything's changed technology-wise. I mean, there just wasn't the same kind of economies and societies that we have today. So the first kind of impulse for a lot of businesses was to go into disaster recovery mode, implementing DR plans, but a lot of those revolve around relatively specific issues. And I mean, the things we know well, the fibers get broken, the equipment's break, we have a fire in the data center, or someone leaves a tap on and the data center floods and all of our equipment's damaged. But what I have noticed over the last few months is that most disaster recovery planning has a very limited number of scenarios that it considers. And the scenario of a global pandemic is just not in the playbook of most networks, most companies for that matter, but specifically most networks. So even when there's disaster recovery planning, a lot of assumptions are made that the disaster is only going to hit your organization, that you're going to lose a data center, or you're going to lose an office building or some, and it's only going to affect you. One of the first things that we felt was suddenly this realization that we couldn't just jump on a plane and go and fix a pop. We had situations on our network where we had technicians having to drive 6 or 8 hours across the country by road because there was no longer a plane trip to get them to the pop that they needed to repair. The other big assumption that we'd all been running on was that we can ship anything we need from China, from the factories of all of our vendors, in 6 to 8 weeks. Even before we hit the lockdown in South Africa, we were having issues with equipment that we'd ordered in December 2019 that only arrived in South Africa in March or April of this year. Also, we assume in our historical context that equipment and sites are going to be available 24/7. Data centers run 24/7, so we should just be allowed in. And now suddenly we have a consideration of saying that says, if you can't get health screening and there's nobody to do a health screening on you as you walk into the data center can't let you in. And so we had a number of major data centers who started to put restrictions on what times we could access them. And then obviously travel restrictions and curfews implemented by the government regulations also further restricted that and made the typical mindset around maintenance windows and nighttime work very much more challenging. And the last assumption that we have in a lot of our disaster planning for most businesses is that you're still going to have most of your workforce, that you're not going to lose potentially 20 or 30 or 50% of your workforce, not necessarily because they became deathly ill, but in the case of the pandemic, that they were infected and thus had to go into quarantine. So I'm not going to, I mean, we all know that the traffic went up, and I'm sure other people are going to talk about that. What I wanted to just talk about specifically in this graph is three things that we saw. The first is that in the old normal, shall we say, you can see a fairly obvious weekly cycle with during the week, the 5 days of the week, the traffic is fairly consistent, and then a weekend peak. And that carried on as we expected to for the first half of the period in the graph here. Then obviously we had the voluntary work from home advice given by the government, and that obviously bumped traffic up a little bit. But what was most interesting is once we moved on to moved beyond the lockdown at the end of March, that pattern of having weekends and weekdays at different traffic levels completely vanished. And that created an environment where there was no downtimes, there were no quiet times on the network, and this was very different. The other interesting thing to just mention here is that that first day of the lockdown in South Africa was, for us, a record traffic day. It was very obvious to us that the entire country had gone home and turned on Netflix and YouTube and whatever other streaming services that they use, and the entire country seemed to be sitting in front of their TVs. And the traffic stats suggest that was the case. So what worked for Vumatel? So one of the biggest things that I think is going to come out of all of the discussions is about traffic and capacity planning. So we were in a position where we had a capacity planning approach that always made sure that we had enough capacity on our network to allow customers to run, even if we have failures on an individual fiber route. And that meant that the network was essentially running at about, or running below 50% capacity, which meant when the pandemic hit, we had the headroom to grow. And if we hadn't been doing that, we would have been in a particularly difficult position. We were also in the advantageous position that we were just in the process of doing major capacity upgrades across the network anyway. And that's just a timing thing. That was us doing something that happened to align with what was going on in the world, and not everybody had that opportunity. But yeah, most importantly, capacity planning, making sure that you've got enough capacity on the network. And this is something that's I know that the internet exchanges have spoken about a lot. When you have the opportunity to install more capacity at a nominal cost. So if you're talking about a cross connect across the data center and it's cheap for you to add an extra 10 gigs or an extra 100 gigs, then do it. Don't wait for that port to get congested. Don't wait for the 90% utilization. Where capacity is cheap, and particularly within the data centers, provision more capacity. And that's what saved many of the networks, is all of that surplus capacity that had been provisioned for maybe next month or maybe next year got used up in a week. And those who hadn't provisioned that extra capacity ended up in trouble. The other thing that worked relatively well is that where we had staff who were already enabled for remote working, it was relatively easy and quick for them to get into the rhythm of being able to make sure that the networks carried on running. Now, in our context, we've got our engineers who are enabled for remote working because they do a lot of their changes from home at night. And so all of those type of staff who'd already had VPNs, already had devices that were mobile, they could get up and running fairly quickly. So what were the challenges that we had? One of the first challenges that hit us was that although we've got used to dealing with load shedding and putting generators in all our office buildings, most people don't have these facilities at home. And so we very quickly had issues where in amongst the pandemic, we had ESCOM load shedding us left, right, and center. And we then had to procure hundreds of UPSs for every single staff member. A lot of staff have laptops that don't last through a normal load shedding period. And there's also people who work hard enough on their computers that they just won't last that long anyway. So load shedding was a very big challenge. For a company like us who provides internet connectivity, it was amazing to me how many of our staff still live in areas that actually have poor connectivity options. They're not yet covered by our fiber network or one of the other fiber networks. They are possibly covered by a mobile network, a 4G or maybe a 5G if they're lucky. But a lot of people in these 4G and 5G areas, the networks became overwhelmed so quickly that they were struggling to be productive and work efficiently. We also had challenges with COVID infections within our field teams. I mean, these are people much in the same way as people in providing food in the shops and all of those kinds of services were on the front line of the pandemic. Many of the field teams who were working to install and maintain the networks were coming in constant contact with people and were at very high risk. And there were situations where we had infections. And obviously going back to the assumption from before, the movement of people and goods became really, really hard. Getting technicians to locations to work on the network, getting equipment for upgrades, and getting anything across the border became a nightmare. Equipment that historically could have taken 2 weeks via ship, suddenly we had ships that were stuck in ports in parts of the world and with their entire crews quarantined, and shipments were delayed by 3 weeks in some cases just because the ship sat in a port and wasn't allowed to move. So one of the other specific challenges that we had is that in the middle of the pandemics, we merged Vumatel and SA Digital Villages, and company mergers are challenging at the best of times, and doing that via online tools is especially challenging. We had to merge company cultures, we had to introduce new people, we had to try and cross-skill between different teams. We had 2 different NOCs who were trying to train each other up on each other's networks, and all of this via video conferencing and phone calls was a huge challenge. I think maintaining morale with all staff was also a big challenge that we faced. And there was a lot of effort put into that by various teams within the company to keep people motivated, to send care packs to people's houses, to give them something to feel excited about in the midst of the dark depths of the pandemic. And many staff had challenges maintaining a semblance of home life in amongst all their work. I know for myself, I had a 1-week-old baby at the start of the lockdown. And yes, that's certainly a challenge in this kind of environment. So important decisions that were considerations for us. So Portia mentioned, I think it was Portia or maybe it was Don, mentioned the double up line speed. So what we did notice is that people's usage pattern didn't significantly change with the double up of the line speeds on our network. But what it did provide is that people who were on those lowest speed packages had some relief, which allowed them to work more effectively. So people who had been on a 10 meg package and were battling to do video conferencing to do their work suddenly had the opportunity to be productive and online. And this people found this very useful. Obviously, on an operational side, we put into place a soft network freeze to avoid risk to our network while we knew that there was such a high chance that we wouldn't be able to fix something if it broke. And the build teams also made a decision to stop doing building in the various areas where we were busy laying fiber. And one of the big considerations there was firstly the health risks of having people moving in and around areas, but also that any build activities poses a risk to power utilities, to water utilities. And at a time when everybody is locked in their homes and has no a way to work around challenges like that, we felt that it was inappropriate to put the communities where we were working at that kind of risk. So in conclusion, we weathered the storm, and some of it I think could have been good timing and some of it was good planning, but we certainly could have done better. Will we be so lucky next time? I'm not sure. But the important question, I think, is how do we ensure that our networks are robust for the future? Are we making the right decisions now to deal with the next big challenge? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Graham. There was a question. I just can't remember which slide he was referring to, but Daryl Theron had asked, what are you planning to do to mitigate the problems as per previous slide? So I'm not sure which slide that was. Daryl, if you can just type out the question for us again with the specific slide you were referring to. Or if you can quickly scroll back up, Graham. It's one of the first few slides.
If I can come in here, I think it might have been to do with when do you do network changes and maintenance when all of a sudden there is traffic on your network all the time. I might have been wrong.
Thank you.
Okay, so I mean the answer to that question is there isn't traffic on the network all the time. People do still actually sleep for a few hours every day. And so we did find that network changes that we typically would do during the week and may extend into the morning while sort of 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning suddenly became infeasible and we had to do them. They had to be finished before 6 a.m. So that when people woke up and had to start working 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock in the morning, that the network was available for them. So that was how we dealt with it. And then obviously, yeah, avoiding unnecessary changes because there just was a higher risk. We gradually started doing more and more changes because we have to maintain the network, but we certainly worked to mitigate this as best as possible. But again, the curfews then on the other side created challenges for us. So it was a balancing act the whole time.
Thank you for that, Graham. There's a question from Anonymous, and they ask, with so many people WFH, is there still a place for the asymmetrical packages?
That's a very good question. So the asymmetrical packages that are implemented on the networks like ours and like many of the other fiber networks are based to some extent on the technology that we use to build the network. So one of the major technologies that we have on our network is GPON. And GPON fundamentally allocates bandwidth asymmetrical. There's half the amount of capacity in the upstream direction on GPON as there is on downstream. And that's baked into the protocol. There's no mechanism to change that on GPON. And so, yes, asymmetrical packages create, specifically when we're talking about video conferencing, create a lot of challenges, and we're aware of that. But we have to then balance that against the technical limitations of the GPON technology. I'd love to be able to give everybody symmetrical, but yes, it has technical challenges, and we are looking at it.
Thank you, Graham. Are there any other questions? We still have a bit of time. See,
there's a question about cat videos. I'm very sorry. My presentation today was very drab. I didn't even get you any proper pictures, and I'm very sorry about that.
There is a comment from Oliver. He says, it is interesting to see the new normal in the internet traffic in various different networks worldwide. We did a measurement study at the several ISPs and ISPs in Europe and US and observed the same traffic effect. The weekend weekday effect vanishes. Often the peak traffic rate didn't increase, but the traffic composition changed, which can largely shift to traffic at certain peering links.
Yes, no, I agree. That is very similar to what we saw. The peak levels didn't go up that much, which from a traffic capacity planning point of view is actually quite nice, because you have to plan your network for your peak traffic. But the aggregate volume of traffic that went through the network on a given day certainly increased substantially. I think to some extent, one of the other factors that led to this weekday weekend effect vanishing was that when you don't have a routine outside of your home, your life becomes a blur. And I certainly felt like weekends and weekdays didn't feel any different. I was still stuck in my house day after day. And I think that probably plays out in the way people were using their connectivity.
Okay, great. There doesn't seem to be any more questions. So thank you so much, Graham. We appreciate your insights and thank you for sharing that with us.
Thanks very much.
Before we move on to our next speaker, I'd just like to remind you that we have a social after the event with DJs in Tech. And I'm just going to share the link with you now so that after the event, you can join the social with us. So the social will be both on, well, it will be live on Facebook. Sorry, it will be live on YouTube, but we will have a room that's open here on Zoom so that you can share a beer, have a chat while you listen to great music. So let me share the link for YouTube. So that will be the link that you use to join the live music from DJs in Tech. And then to socialize and mingle, you are going to use the following link. Great. So once again, thank you to Graham and thank you to everybody that has joined us for this meeting. We do encourage that you participate, send your questions to the Q&A. There is a chat section, but please use the Q&A so that we don't lose your question with all the different chats that are going on in there. So I am going to hand over to Susan Forney. She is from Hurricane Electric, and she will be speaking to us about routing security. So Susan, are you ready?
Yes, I am.
Right, over to you. Let me switch back on your video. Is the video on?
I think
there
so.
We go.
That's
All right, there we go. All
okay,
right.
so go ahead and share the screen.
Thank you, Susan.
Okay. All right, so I am here to talk to you about routing security and COVID-19, and I entitled it, How Staying at Home Made Networks More Secure. Okay, so as you've noticed from Graham's presentation, in 2020, countries were not the only thing that we needed to lock down. The networks started to play a much bigger part in people's lives because everyone was remote and staying home because of the pandemic. And so they needed to be a lot more secure than they had been in the past too. And there was a lot of work being done in the networking industry to accomplish this. And it has also increased our focus on routing security. And while we were sitting at home, we seem to have made some progress in 3 areas that I'm going to talk about today. And the first one is RPKI ROA creation. Next, more networks began to deploy RPKI route origin validation, and IRR record validation has increasingly become more important and people have begun to worry about it and make sure that it's up to date. So the first thing is RPKI ROA validation, or ROA creation. And what I have in this slide is the amount of prefixes in the global table that had ROAs in March of this year when all of this started. And at that point, there were about 20% of the prefixes with ROAs, 19% with valids, 1% with invalids, but it's still a ROA. So that was 80% without and 20% with. But in just about 6 months' time, by this month, actually it didn't grow too much between September and October. So most of the gains were in about 6 months. We increased the amount of ROAs, prefixes that had ROAs, by 4%. Now, 24% of the global table has ROAs versus 20%, just in March. And that is impressive, not only because that's a pretty good gain in a short period of time, but in March of 2020, there are about 862,000 prefixes in the global table. And by this month, there are over 883,000 prefixes in the global table, which means the table itself grew by 20,000 prefixes, over 20,000 prefixes in that period. And yet it would have taken another 4,000 prefixes just to keep pace with what with how much the table grew. And yet, it not only kept pace with how much the table grew, it exceeded it. So that's good news. To understand that 4% increase and get an idea of how much work we've got to do in the future, I'm going to look at how it breaks down. And the first pie chart I have here is how the various RIRs contributed to that extra 4% that we got in that period. And 2% of that 4% came from AFNOG, 35% came from APNIC, 29% came from LACNIC, pretty good LACNIC, 10% came, or 29% rather came from ARIN, 10% came from LACNIC, and 24% came from RIPE. But to understand the significance of that, you have to understand how much of a percentage of each RIR had prefixes ROAs created for them. And so what I've done is I've broken down the percentage of the total prefixes announced by each RIR. And the green bar is how it was in March, and the lime green bar is how it was in October. So in AFNOG, we see that we had about 4.6% of the prefixes originating from AFNOG with ROAs. By October, that was 7.58%. So that's a pretty good increase. In APNIC, it went from 17.39% to 24.18%. And then 8.76% in ARIN in March, 12.29% in September, 30% in LACNIC in March, and 33% in September, and 34% from RIPE in March, and 38% in October. And the large amount of percentage in RIPE is largely due to their very enthusiastic evangelical effort for getting people to create ROAs within their region. And you can see that, just looking at these bar charts, how that has paid off for them. That's really been worthwhile, encouraging people to create ROAs. But that's not the end of the story. So to understand where the work needs to be done, it helps to understand how much of the global table is generated from each RIR. So again, I've got the green bar, the first bar, the dark green one, is the March increase. The blue bar is the October increase. And the orangey bar is the amount of prefixes that are originated from each RIR in the global table. So in AFNOG, we can see that 3.46% of the prefixes of the global table are originated from AFNOG, but they now comprise 7.58% of the amount of ROAs. So when you compare that, that looks pretty good. APNIC is pretty even with 24% of the ROAs now and 23% of the space. When you look at ARIN, it's kind of sad. I hate to say it, it's my region, but We have 12.29% of the ROAs, and we have 36.6% of the IP space. Lots of work obviously needs to be done in the ARIN region if we are ever truly going to make a lot of progress in that global table, getting all of it into ROAs. In LACNIC, they are doing a stand-up job. They have about 10% of the table, yet 33% of the ROAs. That is a really phenomenal effort. And RIPE, again, you can see that with 38% of the ROAs and about 26% of the table, they're doing great. But it doesn't help just to look at this. We should be able to give some credit due to the kind of progress that was made. And my next slide does that. And the clear winner in this category is AFRINIC, because they increased the amount of prefixes that were in ROAs over that period by 66%. So that is an incredibly great job. APNIC was 41%. ARIN was 44%, which isn't bad, but as we saw, they have a lot of work to do. So good start, but they have to keep going. And then LACNIC and ARIN both came in with 15 and 12% respectively. So they're looking okay. All right, so next, let's talk about RPKI, route origin validation. That got an awful lot of attention this year. RPKI ROAs, of course, are only going to count if someone is looking at them. And this year, a lot more people are looking at them. More networks and internet exchanges onboarded RPKI ROV this year. Let's look at who they were. In February, and I should add too at this point that when the year started, PCCW, Tata, and AT&T were filtering for RPKI invalids on their peers. So they were already starting. But then in February, Telia began dropping RPKI invalids, and Hurricane Electric began dropping RPKI invalids on their peers, not on our entire network, just on the peers. NTT in March began dropping RPKI invalids. In May, GTT, Lynx, TerraHost, and WorldStream joined them. And in June, our network, Hurricane Electric, achieved 0 RPKI invalids across its entire network, and Cogent began filtering for RPKI invalids. In July, Telstra and GRIX in Greece deployed RPKI. In August, Google and Hong Kong IX announced their systems. And in September, Swisscom, and actually I can't see my own slide here. And yeah, I can't read it because the video things are are covering it. I've gone blank as to who it is. But anyway, in September, that was added to RPKI. So that was a lot of progress. That's 6 large ISPs and a number of other IXs and content networks. And the reason why this matters is because the number of ISPs participating in RPKI route origin validation has created a much wider net for transiting the internet, for catching RPKI invalids. And with internet exchanges beginning to participate too, that means that on the back end, when people are advertising routes, advertising routes to their route server and thus to each other, a lot more RPKI invalids are being caught. And that means that ROA creation is a lot more compelling, because this year, if you were counting on RPKI to be part of your security package for routing, it became a lot more valuable, because now a lot of people actually are dropping RPKI invalids, and it's much harder for a package to traverse the internet if it's RPKI invalid. So the next thing I'm going to look at is IRR records. It's still our last defense in network security, and it is not our most, I guess, impressive story. I know our IRR records are old and they have not been kept up, but unfortunately, we still rely on them for a lot of things. And just a few years ago, it was pretty easy to ignore IRR records, especially depending on who your upstreams were. You might not even have to think about it. Only some ISPs required it. But then in November of 2018, Telia and NTT began filtering for valid IRR origins and valid AS paths from their peers. And this was important because it caused a lot of people, a lot of people at the last minute to run around and get their IRR records in shape in short order, because all of a sudden a lot of their packets were not making it across the internet. And that was good because again, it cleaned up some of those records. But the problem was that some of the peers for NTT and Telia were too big to fail. They couldn't really filter, apply those same restrictions to larger ISPs like Verizon or CenturyLink, because if they did, then half the internet wouldn't work. And so they weren't able to really filter everyone. But the sad truth is that IR records still are the only way to validate AS paths. RPKI ROAs only validate the origin. The only way to tell whether a network really should be advertising a prefix on behalf of another network is through an IRR record. So if you are not already doing this, you should maintain your IRR records as accurately as you possibly can. Get out there, create those route objects, and make sure that you have a valid AS set and that you've updated the members of it so that your path records are accurate, because they are the only thing that we can use right now to validate that. You also, while you're at it, you should be filtering for bogons, because you should not allow people to advertise them to you, and you also should not allow it. You should not be advertising to anyone else. That includes your private sites. Please don't advertise that. You should be using AS path filters, or what a lot of people call peer lock, to filter out the upstreams, the packets that other people may be advertising to you. If you look at all the tier one ISPs and you figure out and you put those in your path, you will get fewer route leaks. And then announce all your IP space. If you are announcing your IP space, it makes it a lot harder for someone else to do it. So even if you're not using it, security experts in internet routing are saying announce your space. And then set maximum prefix limits against your peers. It helps a lot more than you think. So here's what happens when you don't do that. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of route leaks that were big fails for the internet because we didn't deploy enough security. And the first one that I'm going to talk about is the Google route leak in November of 2018. And this took Google and a couple of other services offline for 74 minutes because a small unfiltered ISP advertised about 500 Google prefixes that it had learned from an IX route server. So if we look at our routing security protocols that can help us prevent this, let's just go down the list and see which ones would have worked. RPKI ROAs? No. That would not have helped us all here because those routes were advertised by Google. They had the ROAs were accurate. They were the right prefix link. They were their right origin. So that wouldn't have helped us. AS path filters or peer lock? No, because in this case, the network leaking the routes did not learn them from an upstream. So that wouldn't have helped. If you'd had only that in place, it wouldn't have kept you from accepting these routes. IRR path filters? You betcha. That definitely would have solved the problem because you would have known that this network was not supposed to be advertising those routes from Google, and you would have dropped them and not accepted them. And maximum prefix limits? Maybe. If your wiggle room for this particular neighbor had been less than 500 prefixes, then yes, that would have shut them down. The next thing the one I'm going to look at is the Verizon's outage in June of last year, when a small company using a route optimizer leaked all of those routes back to Verizon, who accepted them. And then it became, because a lot of those routes were more specific, it became the preferred path for routes transiting Verizon AS701, which is a very large network. So again, let's ask ourselves these questions. Would RPKI ROAs have helped in this case? Maybe, because since the route optimizer was using more specific routes, if up to a /24 had not been allowed by all the prefixes advertised, then yes, possibly a lot of those routes would have been dropped. So it would have helped some. AS path filters, peer lock? Oh yes, this would have been very good because this person was leaking most of the internet. So if that were in place, it would have dropped a lot of those routes. IRR path filters, definitely. This network obviously shouldn't have been advertising those routes, so that would have helped. And maximum prefix limits, that would have shut this down before it even started because it would have been the first thing to be tripped. And obviously this network should not be advertising the entire internet. So that would have solved the problem. So to sum it up, while, quarantines and remote work, weren't the greatest thing. And 2020 has been hard on us because we've been isolated. While we were sitting at home, we got a lot of work, a lot of progress and a lot of work done on routing security. And routing security, like the pandemic, is not over yet. So while you are waiting for things to return to the new normal, I'm going to ask you to please go out there and sign your IP space. Especially people, in parts of the world where maybe your percentages aren't so good, get out there and create those ROAs and let's make everything a little bit better. Clean up your IRR records because until we get a better way to filter for AS paths, it's the only way, and we need clean records to make that accurate. And please take the suggestions I have in this presentation and secure your peering sessions. With that, thank you. And are there any questions?
Thank you so much, Susan. That was great. Yes, we do have a question, and the question is from Paul Muchene. He says, having the greatest share of the global routing table, when compared to the RIPE and AFNOG, why is the percentage of ROA deployed in ARIN much lower?
Well, that is partially political. It is a shame. It should be a stain on ARIN. It is a shame. But the problem was that for a long time, it was very difficult to create a ROA inside of ARIN because of the legal requirements, which are a lot to go in here. And not being a lawyer or an expert in that topic, I can't really talk about them, well, but that is the primary reason why a lot of ROAs were not created in ARIN. And I know that there is a push because so much of the internet now is adopting RPKI for ARIN to catch up, but that really crippled them and kept them from progressing. Also, ARIN, unlike RIPE, did not have the evangelization effort to create ROAs, and you cannot underestimate the impact that has had. RIPE also, I think, has had spillover impact in other regions. I think that their efforts to, encourage people to create the ROAs for their prefixes has, honestly had a global effect, but definitely it's had an effect in their region. And, without ARIN doing those two things, making it easy to create a ROA and encouraging to do it, they've fallen pretty far behind.
Thank you so much, Susan. I don't have any other questions. We do have a minute or so. If anybody else has a question for Susan, please feel free to send it now.
Ben here, I have a question. Panelists don't seem
Hi,
to be
Ben.
allowed to use the Q&A, so I'm just going to ask it like that, if it's okay.
Yes, of course, go ahead.
So, I think I agree with pretty much everything that you said and that you had in your slides, except that I'm not seeing the link to COVID. From my perspective, this is all the culmination of work and planning and conversations that were being had kind of back in 2018, 2019. And the deployments are happening now, but the impetus, I think, is quite a lot older than that.
It probably is, but I think you could say that about anything that's happened during COVID. My point is that we didn't, curl up, die, and give up during the pandemic. Everybody stepped up and did their jobs. And one of the places where they stepped up and did their jobs was in routing security. And to think there's no argument, there's no arguing that things definitely got better over the period that we've been kept at home. And that was just my observation.
Sure.
Thank you for your question, Ben. And thank you so much, Susan. We appreciate your insight. And thank you so much for taking the time to prepare and to join us for this event.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Susan. So the slides will be available on our website. I am sending the link to our websites right now. So after the conference, feel free to go onto our website and you'll be able to find all the slides from Susan, from Graham as well. Now, before we go further, oh, we've got a question before you go. Quick one, it says, how do ISPs, from George Cheng, he says, how do ISPs avoid building huge prefix list from unclean AS set?
Well, it depends on whether you're filtering for that or not. Because if you're filtering for it and it isn't clean, then it won't be accepted. And because Hurricane Electric filters for IRR on all of their peers as well as RPKI. And I work with people every single day who can't get onto our network because their records aren't clean. So that basically is how it it affects people. Just yesterday I was helping someone who did not have their AS set correctly set up, and they weren't able to, they weren't able to advertise their downstreams. And I will say at this point, if you are cleaning up your IR records, be very careful with things like, your AS sets and your export statements, because one thing that will trip you up is having multiple definitions of these things in the various places in the IRR. A lot of people use RADB or AltDB and RIPE or AFNIC or whatever your RIR is. And when that happens, these tools like Hurricane Electrics and NTTs and Telias, all the people that filter, they will go for the first one. They will match the first one they see in the list that they get. They won't go through the entire list. So if your records are not this, if you create more than one AS set with the same name, or you create more than your OTNUM in more than one place and it has different export statements, or your export statements have you have multiple export statements for the same AS, only the first one's going to get used, and that can trip you up. That's just one of the ways that you can go about cleaning things up. But anybody who's filtering for this stuff is going to catch it, and the people who aren't filtering, it's just going to go through. So it doesn't really matter what state your records are in if no one's looking at them. If someone's looking at them, then your packets aren't going to be accepted unless they have the right records.
Thank you so much, Susan. I think that was the last question. Thank you once again. Before we go on to our next speaker, we do know that a lot of us are tired. We're all suffering from Zoom fatigue. And so we just want to find out from our attendees who we've not had a chance to socialize with physically, and from the community, how you've been doing. So I'm going to be running a poll, and we will read the answers during the course of the conference, before the end of the conference. Okay, so feel free to go ahead with the poll. You may start. We have another question, but I think that we can address this question before the end of the conference. Right now, we're going to move on to our next speaker. It is Donald Jolly, and he's going to tell us about the traffic in South Africa during the president's speeches. So over to you, Don.
Oh, I can't answer the poll. That's unfair. Could you answer more than one? Anyway, so I need to do the technology thing. Share my screen. Can we all see that?
Yes. There we go. Perfect.
Okay. So as some of you know, we host a couple of caches in the ZANOG in Durban, and we all know that traffic's increased and all sorts of things have happened. But what I found quite interesting was how the changes from the different CDNs happened during the time of the South African president's speech. So for those, because we do have some international participants, which is fantastic. Some of you, I think it's still super early in the morning. Don't worry, you can still put brandy in your coffee. We had the president address the nation 5 or 6 times over the last 6 months, announcing the level of lockdown and what you were allowed to do and not allowed to do. And what I was just browsing some graphs and noticed that all of a sudden the trend of traffic dropped from certain streaming services during that time, which was around about 8 o'clock in the evening, and it moved to other CDNs. So what you can see here is the first CDN, all of a sudden there's this huge drop of traffic. What we see is that shifted, it wasn't proportional, but it shifted to another CDN, which is basically responsible for streaming news and some of the other channels for the satellite companies. And then I saw the same shift of traffic. This was on the 21st of April with the third speech. What I did learn from that time was it's more fun to take a graph from 48 hours, because you get to see the day before and it just looks more awesome because it has a huge dip, or maybe it's not so awesome when you see that on your graphs on a network. And then you relate that to one of the CDNs and then another CDN. So you can see that the different CDNs are serving traffic from for the different modes of viewing. So in our case, it's Google or DSTV. And then pretty much the same thing. This one, I was a little bit lazy, so I took it almost straight afterwards. You can see that over that time, the same trends. And then again, with the 17th of June, huge increase at that time. And again, just to prove the point, was that first CDN dropped again in the traffic during the speech, and then spiking up for there. So yeah, this was just something fun that I thought I would share with everyone. I guess the CDNs realize this, and speaking to some of them, they do realize that there are certain things that affect what will be, how traffic will be served from their particular clusters. But for networks, I thought they might find that interesting, and that's pretty much it from me.
Thank you so much, Don. I think that everybody might have found that interesting, especially for those that are in South Africa. But since you have decided that you're not going to take questions, I will encourage everybody
Did I say that?
Yes, you did.
Okay, that's cool.
Encourage everybody
I'm happy with that.
Yeah, we can take questions if you want to.
No, that's fine.
Okay, we'll encourage everybody to just find Don at the end, at the social, just ask him any questions that you might have. So we have a minute or so. Susan, we had one last question for you. Are you still around? Susan, are you available? There is a question that we have. We've got a bit of time, but if Susan's not available right now, we'd just like to also encourage you to please subscribe to our mailing list. I'm going to be sending that right now on the chat. So please do subscribe to the SAFNOG mailing list.
I'm here. Sorry, I went to get a drink of water.
No problem. Welcome back. Welcome back. We've got a question for you.
Okay.
That was sent in just after you finished, or just after we finished. The question says, it is from Bucky's. He says, will Aaron change their relying party agreement for the TAL at some point?
I don't know. I really hope they do everything they possibly can to facilitate ROA creation, because, you know, they are such a huge part of the IPv4 global table, and obviously something has to be done. But you know, unfortunately, I'm just, you know, I'm one of the people that belong to Aaron. It's in my region, but I don't speak for it.
Okay, thank you, Susan. I hope your question has been answered, Becky. All right. There is a comment from Aaron though. Aaron Hughes says, very unlikely that RPA will go away, but may be modified over time to make it easier to accept. So that will be it for now.
I'd like to add, Aaron is a former board member of, Aaron Hughes is a former board member of Aaron, the organization, so he is probably pretty authoritative there.
Great, thank you. We appreciate that update and that feedback as well. So we're going to move on now to our next session of the conference, where I will be inviting Ben Madison. He is from Work Online Communications with a few experts from our region. We've got Andrew Owens from NAP Africa, as well as Tarako in South Africa and across other regions as well. We have Tawanda Bwanya. He is from Telco Broadband, as well as Harare IXP. And then we also have Musa Tela. He is from Eswatini Telecommunications. So they will be giving us more insight on how ISPs and IXPs in the region were affected by the global pandemic and how they adjusted their operations. So I'm going to hand over to Ben and the panelists. Over to you, Ben.
Thanks, Portia. So this session, I think, is going to dovetail quite neatly with what Graham was talking about earlier. Because one of the things that we've spent a lot of time and energy talking about is the fact that traffic levels went up and weekends and weekdays got all blurred and stuff like that. But what I've heard relatively little of is what the actual operational impact of keeping networks up and running and functioning looked like on the ground, and how people needed to adapt their ways of working in order to be able to keep the lights on. And that's hopefully what we're going to be able to talk about a bit today. We're still waiting for Musa. Musa, are you there? Ah, there you are.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
So I don't want this to be limited to me asking questions of the panelists if possible. So if people do have questions, please put them in the Q&A, not the chat, because it's not really possible for me to moderate the conversation and keep my eyes on both places at once. But I'd like to try and incorporate other people's questions as they're asked insofar as we can, in order to try and keep this as interactive as possible. But to kick off, maybe the three of you would mind giving a short introduction of who you are, the kind of organization you work for, what your role is, and also, importantly, for the purposes of this conversation, where you operate and what did 2020 look like in terms of the local restrictions that you had to deal with and the other kind of measures that were impacting you. Andrew, Musa, you go first.
Okay, thank you very much, Ben. Thank you. Hi to everyone. They've just introduced me. My name is Musa Tela. I work for a company called Eswatini Telecom. I know a lot of people, they know Swaziland, but we had some transition at some point where we moved from Swaziland to Eswatini. So basically my responsibility, I look after, say, cross-border links for Swaziland, if I can put it that way. We are right next to South Africa. We are a landlocked country. So we've got two neighboring countries, which is South Africa and Mozambique. So I think one of the things that we observed from around March, obviously it was a surge on our network that I would say, possibly we were caught off guard. I think a lot of players, they do understand that when you're in the country, you rely on your neighbors. We are unlike those countries that are closer to the sea. We need to work with partners to get capacity. We need to work with telcos to get to the undersea cables. Most of the time we pick up our content from Johannesburg and also from Mozambique. Maybe let me just end there for now. I will carry on as we carry on with our discussion. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks, Musa. Who'd like to go next?
I will. Thanks, Ben. Hi, my name is Tawanda. I operate out of Zimbabwe for an outfit called Telecontract, operating as telco broadband. And my job is to, I'm the head of technical. So it's basically to make sure the network works. So yeah, we had a very exciting lockdown. We had the privilege, I think, of having South Africa locked down before we did. And so we had a week or so to put some things in place. So I'm looking forward to sharing that experience with everybody. Thanks.
Thanks, Tawanda. And Andrew.
Hey everyone, it's Andrew here. My day job is Snap Africa, which is an internet exchange. Terraco is the co-location portion of the business, and Terraco is the one that pays the salaries. Yeah, we had a very interesting time. You know, I think Graham mentioned that this sort of thing was just never planned for. You know, in a lot of these DRP plans that you have, it's just something that you couldn't. Well, at that stage, you couldn't see. Obviously, going forward, it's just going to be part of everybody's plans. But yeah, it was tough for us. I think, you know, I think across the world, people have said that South Africa had one of the most stringent lockdowns, you know, especially in the beginning, and I think there was a lot of fear mongering as well. So it was difficult to figure out what you were allowed to do and what was safe to do, and you know, so we yes, you know, in the context of that extremely hard lockdown, had to do a lot of stuff when the conversation started, and so it was an extremely busy time for us. And you know, throughout the entire pandemic, it has just been a very busy time for us.
Okay, so following on from that a bit, I think Graham did a really good job earlier of articulating why kind of traditional disaster mitigation planning doesn't really work in this kind of scenario. And for us, certainly the kind of the more traditional, what happens if your site gets flooded kind of planning didn't really play a part in it. So the first thing I'd like to understand is when in kind of February, March time, it became clear that we were going to have to adapt very, very quickly the way that we worked. What preparations did you put in place? Were they things that you were kind of planning to do anyway and you just accelerated them? Did you have to put in place measures that you never thought that you were going to need? What did preparation look like during that kind of month and a half between the world being a relatively normal place and everything going to hell?
Yeah, I'll start on that one. Look, I mean, in the beginning, there was a hell of a lot of disagreement about what everybody on our team thought was going to happen. So we took safety first kind of approach. On the co-location side, we got nurses, trained medical staff onto site, you put in a bunch of procedures to make sure that everybody kept safe. We also, to try and encourage people not to come to site, we offered remote hands 24 hours at no charge. So anything that people needed to do within the facility, they could ask our staff to do it for them at no charge. On the internet exchange side, we've always said we like to keep everybody's available capacity at under 50%. So as soon as you reach 50%, we start hassling you to upgrade. And we were already running at 50% on a lot of the infrastructure. So we, over a week or two, added a significant amount of capacity to the internet exchange. And looking back now, it kind of seemed overkill at the time. But given what we saw when people started working from home, it was just the right amount. We added about a terabit of capacity to the internet exchange, and that that was definitely a good thing. It was a requirement.
Mr. Otwanda?
Okay, I think on our case, it was slightly different. I think one of the things that I mentioned was, as a landlocked country, so we entirely rely on partners that can connect us, obviously, to the outside world. I think one of the disadvantages that we have, we don't have a lot of content as a country. So we, around March, we were busy undertaking a few projects. One of them was to take care of the power lines, because we feel like they are not as vulnerable as the ordinary fiber connecting to the outside world. And that project was at sort of its initial stage. And for whatever reason, because of the lockdown, some of the suppliers, they couldn't travel. So we're like stuck. So in other words, we had to, because we've got quite a number of borders facing Mozambique and Swaziland. So we had to sort of run around to all the partners to say, can we upgrade? Can we do this? So in short, it just caught us off guard. So we're not prepared for that amount of traffic. And everyone was like, okay, maybe we can give you capacity, maybe to Mozambique or South Africa, but we will deliver, say, in about 8 to 10 weeks. As a country, the traffic was maxing on the pipes. So the pipes were like closer to bursting. So we had to move around. Some of the things were not possible because of the lead times and everything. But yeah, we managed to sort of see how we can work things around. But again, it was just not sufficient. So to an extent whereby, when your customers, because we also we look after Eswatini in terms of pulling fiber across the regions. So to some extent, some of the requests or applications were not processed because of insufficient capacity. So it came in twofold. In terms of getting your suppliers to bring things in the country, that was an issue. In terms of getting your partners now to work with you to sort of do some upgrades, that was also a second issue. So yeah, we were like tossing in between, to an extent whereby at some point you felt like maybe money was not an issue in terms of how much you want us to pay you for that connectivity. But the bottom line was like, maybe there isn't enough capacity to connect.
Twandi, we've just lost your video. I don't know if you're still with us. Ah, there you are. Anything to add to that?
I was just going to switch off the fan. It was making a lot of noise. Yeah, so I think our experience started off early March when we saw, the rest of the world going into lockdown. We kind of started dusting off the disaster preparedness, matters, and I think the biggest challenge came around, just trying to ensure business continuity before we even start thinking about the clients. We had a huge challenge when we started looking at where's our stuff, and we discovered that like already the gentleman from Vuma said, how many people are in areas that you can't actually cover. So that kind of threw a lot of spanners for us. So we had to start testing. We I think mid-March, we split up the workforce. We said, you guys are going to work from home. We're going to test this thing. That pretty much gave us a week, which wasn't enough. But yeah, so that was the biggest challenge. And we discovered how reliable our 3G, 4G networks are then as well, because, we had people on voice over IP, but we had to change and see how we can hook up directly to the PBX with normal cell phone lines, because we couldn't handle some of the circuits couldn't handle the voice over IP. And then, of course, like I said, all around, just trying to get the business continuity collaboration, just to agree on what we're going to use, became a matter. The techies were happy with GT and the likes, and all that. So in the end, we actually ended up having a big blue button on net, because we felt there would be better control that way. So that was as far as business continuity. And then the other exciting thing that happened was obviously the customers we had, because we're typically a very enterprise-facing entity as well. We had now this request from enterprises about staff connections. Those who reacted quickly were like, okay, I've got 60 workforce that I need connected within the next few weeks, and it was a bit of a nightmare. So yeah, that was the beginning for us. We kind of went head first in there, and made some of the plans as we went, because there was no way we could have been prepared for it.
Thanks for that. So, obviously the first thing that comes to mind for all of us, I think, that are operating networks is, we see a wave of traffic coming over the horizon. We start doing upgrades. But I'd like to get a sense of, and I think this is going to be very different for all three of you, the actual physical act of keeping a network up and running and connecting customers and provisioning circuits and swapping out line cards. It requires things and people to be in a particular place at a particular time. And one of the things I haven't really heard any of you talk very much about is what, if any, kind of planning around the scenario where you couldn't physically get to the same country your equipment's in, or the same province, or the building that your equipment's in. What happens when you've used all your spares and the closest one is an ocean away and there's no more coming into the country? I mean, what was the view that you took on that? Or was that just too far over the horizon as compared to the more immediate problems that, that had to wait for its turn in line?
Yeah, I'll comment about the physical aspect. I think in South Africa, we were lucky in that the government realized that because everybody was working from home, they saw the internet and anything that was connected to the internet as a critical resource. So it was reasonably easy for us to, get permits for our staff. We obviously had to change, because we had an influx of people requesting, cross connects and remote hands, and specifically the things that you're talking about, swapping line cards and that sort of thing. We had to split the operational teams into two different teams, that would work at different times, and it was a sort of an on-off shift type of thing. The difficulty for us, of course, is that the nature of the business that we do on the co-location side is all physical work. We're not we don't run or operate or own any of the equipment inside the racks in our data centers, but we're responsible for all of the physical things happening around that. And so it was a tricky planning process. But as I said, I don't know what the situation was in the other countries, but I think we were lucky that the government realized it was a requirement. So they were quite lenient on us in that respect.
Okay, I think from Eswatini, I think one thing that I learned during, around the beginning of March, it's more on collaboration, because again, the borders were closed and people, they couldn't move. The courier companies, yes, to some extent, they could move things around. But I think the biggest challenge was most of our suppliers, they were working from home. Obviously, when they are working from home, they are not as efficient as when they're in the office. The response time was not good. Maybe say we are looking for line cards or whatever it is, trying to handle the amount of traffic coming from the customers. So in our case, we ended up, because we've got some partners, let me put it that way, that are co-locating within our data center. So it was a situation whereby you need to start making calls, negotiating and loaning quite a number of devices, line cards, and so on and so forth. And that was very, very helpful. So I think from a partnership perspective, it's always good to have very, very good relationship with, the people you work with. To an extent whereby some of them, they didn't even want money. They said, no, just go and take that spare router, praying that their main or their primary router won't have issues. So that was the situation. And one of the things I also mentioned is we had another company or a supplier that was coming from overseas that couldn't even move an inch to come and assist. So, but I would say maybe it was something like we are like in an island whereby we are not used to, things like our normal life, we just place an order and then maybe wait for the courier company to deliver in a couple of days and so on and so forth. But all of a sudden, we have this massive traffic and you don't know how to handle the traffic. I remember one of the good days, we have one of the popular big players, they have their cache server within our data center. And then it just went off to an extent whereby we had to start pulling traffic or that cache information from the neighboring country. In this case, it was from Terraco. And imagine those pipes are already running flat, and then we've got the fill up coming from the cache server. So it was, we couldn't obviously cope with everything, I must say. But yeah, we really tried our level best to see how we manage. To some extent, I must say the performance of the network degraded. But again, you always see how you work things out, and just to make sure that it does not go beyond like in the days of dial-ups and whatever it was those days.
Thanks, Mr.
Yeah, I'll also speak to the element of workforce. We had a situation where you couldn't guarantee, although most of our teams were mobile from home, you couldn't guarantee that someone would make it to site if there was need for physical presence. So one of the things we did early April was that we actually had to set up our own quarantine centers, as it were. So these were lodges that were not going to be used for a while, thanks to the lockdown. And we isolated certain members of the teams. And so these guys pretty much had near zero contact with the rest of the world. And so this was our fail-safe, that because we had situations where sometimes, the lockup, the police or the military in certain instances would be manning the roadblocks, and sometimes they wouldn't care what you're going to do. They'll just stop your people. So that was our fail-safe. You had people in specific, for us specifically in Harare, the capital city, in Bulawayo, the second largest city, we had teams that were actually isolated to make sure that our data centers, if we need physical presence, somebody can actually drive there and attend to those issues. So the rest, I totally identify with what my colleague from Eswatini is saying. Fortunately, I think for us on capacity, yes, we are like Eswatini, we are landlocked as well. But fortunately, there was almost a chase between the need for more connections. So we had a huge upsurge in people trying to get fiber to the home all of a sudden, and then vis the demand on the capacity. So we almost had a good leg to prepare, because typically would say if it's doorstep fiber would take 14 days to connect. That went up to 30-35 days, and that also gave us time to sort out some capacity issues. We had enough equipment, fortunately, as well for spares and so on. So we never had issues where we were stuck.
Thanks for that. That makes sense. So I want to pick up on something that Musa said that I think is really important, and Andrew also raised during our prep session a couple of days ago, which was the role of kind of community interaction. And I think there are two sides to this. There's the element that Musa was talking about being able to, because of the relationships that you've got in the community, being able to reach out to people and, beg, borrow, steal, equipment and ask for help where it's necessary. But I think there's another side to it as well, which is a lot of us, our job relies on us being able to interact and communicate and cooperate with other operators and other members of this community. And for myself, at least, that's probably the part of my daily life that's been the most disrupted this year. So I'd like to understand, to what extent that's true for you guys, and also how have you been able to work around that, and if so, how? How are you filling that gap in the absence of things like in-person conferences and aeroplanes being in the sky? And
Yeah.
do you want to start with this one again?
Yeah, sure. Look, and I've always said, and I've had this conversation a lot in the last couple of weeks. The internet runs on beer, and that's always been the joke. But there is that social interaction that makes this work. And we in South Africa, I think, are very privileged because we have very strong NOGs. We have a very strong community. So exactly that. If somebody was struggling to get a piece of equipment, it was easy to reach out to the community and get assistance on that. We started holding a bunch of training sessions as well. We called them I think initially they were called the Tech Hour, because there was so much Zoom stuff going on, and Teams and meetings that should have been emails and that sort of thing. But we just used this as an opportunity to start speaking about things like routing security and clouds and that sort of thing that are coming in. I think one of the things that Susan mentioned was the increase in ROAs in the Afrinic region, and we ran a couple of ROA or RPKI workshops. But at the same time, I think what happened during lockdown is that we saw a lot of networks catching up on admin that they might not necessarily have had time to do previously. It's interesting for us, if we look at the graphs and we see how traffic patterns change, it's clear to us that people are spending a lot more time online. When you have this fear of going outside or a restriction on going outside, you're going to end up sitting in front of a device, doing things, learning things, going to new places. And we certainly saw a lot of that, and that's evidenced by the increase in ROAs in the Afrinic region. It's just a lot of people just spent all of that time, but I think that social interaction is definitely missing, and that I think that is something that probably needs to come back in the future.
Yes, I agree with you, Andrew. I think to me, personally, I think that really helped me. Because to be honest, to some extent, uh, when you are talking to someone and then whoever you're talking to can attach your face, it makes life easy, you know, to an extent whereby if maybe I call South Africa is a neighboring country, or maybe someone from SAFNOG or something, it's easier always when you know that person. So to me, it's like one of the things that really helped us, because sometimes we used to have issues with maybe one of our pops in Johannesburg, but it was easy because you could call someone and say, you know what, we have a problem with one of the SFPs. And one of the things that we also appreciate, even from a Terraco perspective, is they were able to help us like 24 hours, if I can put it that way, because of the pressure that we were working under. We used to have situations whereby the next minute, someone from our ministry, maybe, or the minister wants connection, or somebody else wants internet connection, and we don't have enough resources. So we were able to sort of manage quite a number of things. Obviously, we didn't do very well, let me put it that way. But we're able to cope and see who we can talk to, who can help at that given time. It was like, I don't want to say firefighting, but I would say it was something like, you need help, you need to look for someone who can help at that given time. And then I think that was also a problem from Eswatini now, was when we have issues, the response time from all English was not as good as we wanted to. Because people, they had to travel. One of my colleagues mentioned things like roadblocks and everything. So you want someone to be somewhere in the next, say, 1 hour. But because of the restrictions and whatnot, so you will find that the person will be there, or that engineer will be on site in the next 6 hours. And then there you are, we have got customers that are breathing on your neck. They want connectivity, you know. So it was something like, or it's something like, you get a problem, you look for a solution. You get another problem, you look for another solution, you know. So you don't have like one solution for all the issues that we're facing, or are facing on the ground.
Yeah, and I'll just, Ben, I'd add on to this. I mean, we haven't necessarily seen a slowdown in the number of ISPs that are coming up. It's just been interesting to us that during the lockdown, a couple of ISPs started up and came to the internet exchange to peer. And the difference was that it cost us a lot more support time, because these were new businesses, these were new people, you know, and they didn't have that community support. You know, it just didn't really exist during the lockdown. You can't call it the same thing by, you know, being on an email list or a Telegram group or a WhatsApp group. It's just not the same, you know, because again, you don't see that face. And yeah, I'm worried about the guys that are starting up now, the guys that are starting to get into you know, peering and networks and that sort of thing. They just don't have that opportunity to be part of the community in the way that I feel it has happened in the last couple of years. Yeah. And I, you know, I'm worried about what that means going forward.
Yeah, our experience was slightly different in that it did expose us, because we do not have a very active community. In fact, a colleague reached out for this, saying, look, we need some visibility because we don't have that support system. And so in most cases, it did boil down to personal relationships with different ones, especially in, you know, career relations and so on, where you actually do know the person you're calling, and maybe they can reach out to this engineer to get it sorted out. But I think my takeaway from the last 6-7 months has been we do need that community, because there are times where you're trying to figure out who's leaking what, and you can't get hold of anyone. You don't know who has got comms to which organization. So I think as a country we do need a more active community around that.
Yeah, absolutely. So that, I think, is quite a good note to end on. So there are no questions in the Q&A so far. Maybe people are just waiting for a barrage at the end, but we are running short of time. So just before we do, I think kind of Tawanda, you probably answered this for you, which is that you kind of your big takeaway and what you would do to prepare for next time to a certain extent is, focusing on building that community ahead of time so that when you need it, it's there. Musa and Andrew, if you had this to go over again, how would you prepare differently, or how would you prepare for this to happen over again differently? Or alternatively, is there something that has changed in the way that you operate your network that you found so effective that actually you think it will outlast this kind of period of madness that we're going through?
Yeah, I keep going back to the fact that a lot of the preparation and a lot of what helped the South African community has simply been the community. We never felt like we were alone during this time. I think we all understand that the internet is absolutely vital, and I think that's one of the things that the pandemic showed everybody, is that this is something that everybody needs, and it needs to be protected. Obviously, I hope that this never happens again. That would, certainly not be great. But I think that we've gotten to a point now, and I think a lot of people have gotten to a point now where we are comfortable with the way that things are working right now. There are certainly things that we would want to change, but we understand that this is the situation that we are in at the moment. And it's going to be an interesting time going forward. Seeing how people change, how their policies change. I wouldn't want to be in the real estate market now for office space. At the moment. But yeah, definitely, I think people's disaster recovery plans are going to be a lot more meticulous and a lot more verbose going forward. Look, the internet, creaked a little bit during the pandemic, but it stayed up. It kept everybody connected. It's still running, and I think that's just a good testament to the good work that everybody has done.
Thanks, Andrew. Musa, if you had a do-over.
Okay, thanks, Ben. I think in our case, I think one of the things that I just missed the last part when you were asking the question, I think for whatever reason, but take out from what we have gone through in the last 6 to 7 months. Obviously, we felt like now as an organization responsible for connecting Eswatini to the rest of the world, we felt like, you know what, I think to some extent, it's always good to have more than enough. Obviously, it comes at a cost, but it's always good to have more than enough. The reason why I'm saying that is because I think in our case, we were just caught off guard. We're just making some preparations to get more pipes and whatnot to Eswatini. And then in the middle of nowhere, there came the pandemic. And then we couldn't move an inch. So we had to survive with the capacity we had at that given time. So I think, Ben, what is important, maybe one of the things that we also learned from the 6 months duration is that we couldn't do as much as we wanted, because of the limitations, the policies were changing every single day. You know, like things were, the next minute, this shouldn't happen, this you should do it this way. So from an operation point of view, we had to adapt and change things by the day, because if something else or something new comes, then you need to change the way you operate. Even from now talking about the engineers on the ground, because then we had to start working shifts to an extent whereby we find that this week, maybe we've got 2 engineers on the ground that are working. So you couldn't deliver as much as you want. And again, when they are working now, I'm talking about now they are working on the ground, then you need to start talking about social distancing and the other things that you need to conform to the rulings and everything. So I must say that it was a challenge, but we also learned from the challenge. And like I've said, one of the things that we also need to think about, or that we are trying to work around, is to have more than enough at any given time. I know there are some policies in terms of capacities, like, you know, we get to a 70, you need to start upgrading. Some of those things, they fell down the cracks. And then there you are, we are sitting at 90%, and then you are seeing a big surge on your network that you couldn't cope with. So those are some of the things that we also learned in the duration of the pandemic since March. Thank you.
Thanks, Musa. So I think Portia's going to kick us out now. If there are any questions that haven't been answered, then do so right now, because her video's back on and she's coming for you. Okay. Well, thanks to Andrew, Tawanda, and Musa. Hope that was at least vaguely interesting. I certainly found that interesting. And back over to you, Portia.
Thank you so much, Ben. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Musa. And thank you, Tawanda. This was really great. It was interesting to get a perspective from not only within the country, but also our neighboring countries. So thank you so much for your time, the time that you've taken to prepare and also to participate in our event. Okay, so I'm going to stop the poll now and just read out the responses that we've received. Okay, so we've got 50 votes, and I'm just going to go through the questions and just give you a sense of the responses that we've got in percentages. So the question was, what distinguishable change do you identify with as an impact of the COVID-19 global pandemic? The first answer was no more travel or reduced travel. So we've got 18% of the total attendees that voted no more travel or reduced travel as a direct impact to them. So the second option was more time to explore new or different ideas, professional and personal. So that got 28%. And then the third option was no more physical interaction with my peers from the community. And that was 26% of our attendees. Option 4 was missed knowledge and experience from lack of physical conferences. That was 8%. And then we've got too much time spent without travel, which was good for me and my family at 14%. And then we have too much time spent without travel, which was not so good for me and my family. And that was astounding. I'm kidding. So the responses that we got on that question was just 6%. So the most impact that our community has felt as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic was more time to explore new or different ideas professionally and personally. So I'm going to share the results. There we go. So thank you so much for taking part and just giving us a sense of what you went through or the impact that the COVID-19 global pandemic had on you personally and professionally, as well as part of this community. So thank you so much for all those that took part in this poll. So once again, I'd like to thank all our speakers and our panelists that took part in this meeting. We appreciate the time and the effort that you put in to make this meeting happen. We'd like to give a special thank you so much to our sponsor, Teraco, would not have been possible for us to have this meeting without your support. We do really value it. As I said, we have a social that's ready for us. So for everyone that's going to be joining the social, I've posted 2 links. There's the live session on YouTube. You can find the link in the chat. And then we've also created a Zoom chat where you can grab your beer and join us, have a chat, say hello to a few people. Please note that we will have all the slides on our website. There's also a link that has been provided there. I'm going to just resend it again so that you can go through the presentations once again. We will put up the video, the recording, on our YouTube channels, both on SAFNOG and ZANOG side. Thank you once again to everybody that has taken time to join us today for the SAFNOG and ZANOG virtual conference. I don't have anything else from my side. If anybody else has a question or a comment, I think it's time to go grab a beer and join some fun with DJs in Tech.
Because I have to have the last word, Portia, thank you very much for
You're welcome.
hosting this.
You're most welcome, Don. It is only a pleasure. Okay, so everyone, please head over to YouTube and to our social room. I'll send the link one more time so that you don't get lost somewhere. And with that, I'd like to say have a good afternoon and see you at the social. Cheers, everyone. Thank you so much.
Cheers.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye-bye.